Welcome to the Future of Clean, where each week we talk with experts about how to go clean today so every brand can go clean in the future. The clean beauty journey is different for everyone. Indie brands have a clean slate, while traditional brands may adjust formulations or an ingredient sourcing strategy. Meanwhile, chemical suppliers may feel pressure to bolster their clean profile. How can we reconcile these stages? In this two-part series, we discuss strategies for embracing a spectrum of clean beauty approaches. Our guest, Nicole Acevedo, helped design the clean framework for Beautycounter, which was recently valued at over $400 million. Acevedo now helps other brands create clean and sustainable beauty through her firm, Elavo Mundi Solutions. Acevedo is a reproductive environmental health scientist with expertise on the health risks of everyday exposure to hormone-disrupting chemicals. Dr. Acevedo received her doctorate in molecular and integrative physiology at the University of Michigan. Nicole, thanks so much for joining. We're very happy to hear your perspectives on clean beauty and the future of clean beauty. Your background is in reproductive and environmental health. Why did you decide to focus on this area of study?
So really, I began my professional career as a reproductive biologist, and my focus was in clinical infertility. So I was really interested in how kind of naturally, due to natural and environmental factors, our fertility is affected. And I became really keenly aware of the environmental impact on our health while I was working in clinical infertility. And it actually became an aha moment for me while I was still working in that field that, we're not addressing these bigger issues around our health in the clinical setting in what I perceive to be a meaningful way, because we're not looking at the root causes from an environmental perspective. And about that time, this is about 2010, I actually was introduced to a book that changed my course of career and really my life passion, and it's Our Stolen Future. The book is called Our Stolen Future, and it was written by Dr. Theo Colburn. And this story reads like it's almost like a detective novel. This researcher was really instrumental in piecing together critical data, really research that was out there in many different fields, and realizing that there were common links. And the common links were related to environmental contaminants, so industrial chemicals in our environment. So in a lot of ways, I don't know if you're familiar with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, but that book, that really, it was more than a book. It spawned a movement to really bring our awareness to contaminations in the environment. In Rachel Carson's case, it was around pesticide. It was DDT, right? Pesticide contamination. But Dr. Colburn took it to another level, and she was really acknowledging that there was a tremendous amount of evidence out that industrial chemicals were actually interfering with our natural hormone systems and were affecting our health over time. And significant and potentially not as clear ways, which is what makes this field really fascinating. So this was in the late 80s, and the early 90s was when this field really came into its own. And so as I'm reading this book, and I was just, it was goosebumps. It was speaking to me on every level. Like, this is what I've been working in.
That's incredible.
Basically. This is so, and it was one of those things. I call it coincidence or whatnot, but as I was reading the book, one of the labs that one of the researchers was described in one of the chapters was working in Boston, and I was in Boston at the time. And so I honestly just reached out to this researcher. Her name is Dr. Ana Soto, and cold called, basically.
The greatest cold call of history.
Yeah, it was worked. Really amazing. Just like, this, her brand of research was really what was calling to me the most. So anyway, long story short is I reached out to her, and it ended up working out really well. And I ended up leaving my clinical career and moving into academic research in endocrine disruption research. So really what this field is really focused on is understanding these mechanisms around how these chemicals, whether they be synthetic and industrial pollutants or whether they be phyto, but derived from natural sources, all these things can interfere with our hormonal system. And when it's out of balance, it can really wreak some pretty bad effects over
Mm.
time. Neurological defects, cancer, reproductive issues, which we have documented quite keenly over time. So there's a lot of, there's a spectrum of issues. So this really honed in what I felt was the big picture, which is, essentially since not the turn of the century, I shouldn't say that, but really after World War II, so in the 1940s, was where this big boom of industrial chemical production went into effect. And over the last, 70 plus years, we've been in a space in this world that never existed before then, of really high volume chemicals being produced with very little oversight globally until relatively recently. So, it became a question of, okay, I'm seeing these effects. I've already seen what I can make some correlations of some of these chemicals to some specific adverse health outcomes and environmental outcomes. What are we going to do about it? Or what are we doing about it that's meaningful? And actually, that's what serendipitously led me to start working in the marketplace,
Wow.
from the academic sector right into the marketplace.
So that's a heck of a transition. You go
Yeah.
from being inspired by reading this book, cold calling, and soon discovering that there was this broader narrative, and then entering the marketplace in more of an applied way, perhaps. And
Right.
so I want to get to your current work at Elavo Mundi, but tell me a bit about the background that you had working with Beautycounter and building out their strategy. And then tell me a bit about how that transitioned into your own consulting firm.
Yes. So when I was finishing my postdoc in Boston at Tufts Medical School, I was looking for next steps. And once again, no intention of working in industry or the marketplace. I thought it was all around regulation, like working more intentionally in the regulatory space was what was going to lead to better outcomes for consumers. And I was approached by Beautycounter to come on and be their scientific director for their entire environmental health program.
Wow.
And
So what was that moment like?
I will say it was very interesting. My initial instinct was no, because as an academic scientist, that's a scary transition. You're putting a lot of your scientific integrity on the line in case it's not the real deal. So it was definitely a leap of faith to say yes. But what made me take that leap was having a real clear understanding of how Beautycounter was approaching ingredient safety and sustainability, and seeing the role that I could play in helping to bolster that effort in a really meaningful way. So really taking a look at ingredients that are currently used in the personal care space and cosmetic space in general, and really understanding from a strong scientific standpoint, what does safer mean? Safer is a spectrum. We have to appreciate that, right? So any chemical on any given day has a potential to harm. We have to remember that. But when you're dealing with, when you're creating consumer goods and you understand the sourcing and the chemical makeup and how those can potentially interact in a product, that's when you get a bigger picture around ingredient safety and product safety. So I didn't see anybody else in the marketplace approaching ingredient safety that way. And so to me, that was both a challenge, but also what I felt was a meaningful way to use all the expertise I had and also the passion I had around chemical safety and chemical regulation to good use in a really direct way, right? So creating better products is essentially the fastest way to make sure that you start to move toward eliminating more harmful chemicals in the marketplace.
The Future of Clean is brought to you by Apronova, because we're committed to helping every brand deliver on the values we believe in: safety, performance, sustainability, and transparency. Learn more at apronova.com or find us on social media like LinkedIn and Twitter.
You raise a great point, and I'm interested to hear your perspective because, as you mentioned, that the cosmetics industry has not been well regulated, especially in the United States. More regulation in the EU, and some in the industry have a real issue with scaremongering or fear mongering and talking about ingredients in a negative way.
Right.
How do you reconcile that push and pull, where you want to ensure that there's safety of the highest level, but there's also traditional industry that is saying, well, there's regulations in place, and as long as it's legally compliant, then we should be fine. What's your perspective on that dialogue?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually, it's an appropriate way for me to segue from how we move from Beautycounter into the scientific consulting work that I'm doing now. Working for a company that was so defined by ingredient safety standards that were really leading industry standards around better product development, I knew so clearly that this needed to become the norm, right? It can be done. So, the fact that you can develop and you can, create a business opportunity, basically defying the industry in a way by pushing for transparency and better product safety, it became really clear that this is a profitable venture. And at the end of the day, business can be used for good, right? So, so I became extremely incentivized, not only from working directly at Beautycounter, but also with my interaction with different industry organizations and not just industry organizations. There's some consortium groups that are really bridging the industry sector with the nonprofit sector, with the regulatory agency sector, and the consumer advocacy groups in general, to really be focused on how do we move markets for better product development, safer product, more sustainable product development in meaningful ways. So when working with those groups, which I continue to work with at this time, it became really clear, it's like there is a movement that's in place. So this movement towards safer chemistries and this movement towards more sustainable strategies, it's already there.
It's there.
It's where everybody's going, even the multinationals, even the ones that don't openly discuss these issues. Everyone's moving in that direction. Smaller brands have the ability to be more vocal and delineate the guardrails a little bit more publicly, but everyone's moving in this direction. So I realized, wow, we have a moment in time here, specifically around clean beauty, to really define it well and have it be meaningful. Because one of the things that I became concerned about was, as I moved, like I said, as I transitioned from academia and moved more into the industry, was realizing, wow, terms matter. People really latch on. Consumers really latch on to terminology that they can find meaningful. So if it says all natural or organic or green,
right,
people have a frame of reference for that. The problem is these are unregulated terms, except for organic, but natural is an unregulated term. Well, I didn't want clean beauty to be an unregulated term that was just, undefined.
Casually used.
Amorphous, yeah. So what I saw was a very precise moment where I'm seeing how powerful it is as a concept and how it can manifest into a really thriving business for a company. And I'm seeing other people try to negotiate how they're going to also be in this space, but they don't know the toolkit. They don't understand how to move this forward. And so that was my primary incentive to start my own scientific consulting business in this space, was I want clean beauty to mean something. So I understand the premise clearly. That's what I stepped into, and I've been able to make that premise be more refined through the work that I've put into it. So I want to see more people be doing this. And beyond that, just one more point of clarification. One other thing that became extremely clear was, every member of the supply chain needs to be on board with what this is and what this means. And that's been, it became very clear to me a few years ago that the supply chain communication around safer chemistry is more sustainable, and what the consumer goals and desires around that is not necessarily being translated upstream from companies or brands to their material suppliers and their value chain partners. So it creates a lot of tension and a lot of reactivity that is, in my opinion, not necessary for the long haul, because we can open up these lines of communication so that the understanding of what clean is, of what safer, cleaner, all the terms really are, so that the value chain is on board and it becomes a collaboration instead of a point of resistance.
So we both agree we want every brand to be able to adhere to these kinds of principles. You mentioned supply chain. Are there certain recommendations that you think brands at that stage of new product development, or really assessing their entire supply chain up to product delivery and end of life for a product, what are some recommendations you would provide to help them achieve that kind of higher standard that consumers are demanding?
Yes. So one thing that I am very clear about is that clean, as we understand it, is a spectrum. There is, you can go all the way to one side and be focused primarily on human health safety, so that, the safety of your consumer. You can go to the other end of the spectrum and be focused primarily on the environment, so sustainability factors, circularity, all of those issues. Very few people can do that whole spectrum and do it well. It's not impossible, but that's, I think, why there is currently a clear spectrum around clean. It's not a defined term. Now, what I recommend is that when a brand or a supply chain member approaches me, to understand how they can actually work within this meaningfully, within this clean space meaningfully, the very first thing I ask is, where do you stand on the spectrum? What's your definition of clean? What are the choices you are willing to make as a brand, or as a raw material supplier, in order to fall into this space meaningfully? And then it becomes, because everyone's going to have a slightly different angle and a slightly different goal with their company. And that's what's great, right? That's why I think that there's a space for everybody. But as long as there is clear vision and integrity in what clean really means, and that these are the tenets it needs to uphold in some way, shape, or form, and then you clearly communicate that as a brand or as a company to your consumer or your client, if you're a raw material supplier, this is where we stand, this is how we define clean, then the integrity is in place, in my opinion. So really it's about, like I said, understanding there's a spectrum and where do you fall within it, and then formulating to that standard. So having very clear formulation guidelines in place for how you're going to meet that. And that part of that is understanding what your, like I said, what your brand specific requirements are, and also, what the regulation that is currently in place, what regulation is important to uphold based on what your markets are. And then, to me, really what the clear differentiator between just better and what is clean is really about making sure you move beyond compliance. So this is not just about meeting a regulatory requirement, which may or may not change in a given amount of time. It's about having a perspective around, could this ingredient have a potential to cause harm? In what way? Even if it's not regulated. And so that's where I think it's really important to keep the beyond compliance factor in mind when formulating for clean.
Thanks for listening to our episode with Nicole. Make sure to subscribe to hear part 2 of this series.